For a long time, the U.S. was a leading force in international development cooperation. But since Donald Trump's return to the White House, the country has dramatically slashed its contributions. And in an increasingly uncertain world, many other nations are boosting defense spending at the expense of their foreign aid budgets. That has left organizations like the UN with a funding crisis. So far, with half the year gone, the UN has received only $5.6 billion to fund its global aid programs in 2025. To put that into perspective, it had originally hoped to raise $44 billion. That's just under 13% of the original target they've achieved. The United Nations says it's the biggest funding shortfall in its history, and it's scaling back its global humanitarian aid plans.
Today, we're having to prioritize even further. We're having to hyper-prioritize. Brutal funding cuts have left us with the cruel math of doing less with less. Even as the world around us remains on fire, and as people die because we don't have the resources to save them.
Damian Lilly is a seasoned humanitarian, spent many years working for the UN, and is today an independent consultant working on humanitarian peace and security issues. Today, he joins us from Maputo in Mozambique. Damian, welcome to DW. Does this funding crisis pose an existential threat to the UN and the people who rely on its assistance?
Yes, I think the funding crisis at the moment facing the UN, I think, is the greatest that it's faced since the start of the organization. So this is putting millions of lives at risk, and the important work for the UN around the world, with many lives put in jeopardy as a result of these funding crises.
Who will be most affected by these cuts?
Most affected will be people in the humanitarian crisis around the world, people in war situations, people affected by climate change, people reliant on the UN for food assistance that's being cut dramatically, people are reliant on the UN for medical health services, and even people in protracted conflicts. This isn't just about the most acute crisis, but also those that have been relying on aid for many, many years and now being put in extreme difficulty, and no certainty that this is going to change anytime soon.
But in a recent article, you argued that this was a predictable crisis. How so?
Well, I think we've seen the greatest hit to funding this year, but this has been something that's been building for the last few years. The Trump administration's cut in aid has been the one that's grabbed the headlines. But if you look over the last few years, it's been the various other governments, the UK, Germany, France, many others that have cut aid. So the real peak aid was back in 2023. And so what we're seeing is an acceleration of that trend and the drying up of foreign aid. And it's not going to end anytime soon. I think the predictions, there's reports out today predicting that humanitarian funding could fall as much as 50% by next year. And so we're looking at half the level of humanitarian aid that we saw only a few years ago. This is a massive, massive shock to the aid system. This is putting it back 10 years in terms of the kind of assistance that's being provided. And it's still sending shockwaves through the humanitarian and aid system, which is only grappling about the consequences and how it can deal with this situation.
What's the reason for these funding cuts we're seeing? The U.S. aside, it's a different animal in that sense, but other countries have, of course, also slashed contributions. Why?
Well, I think the political situation's changed. I think people in many countries that have been traditional donors of aid, and remember that it's very much concentrated in the US, Europe, that make up the large proportion of aid around the world. And the political situation's changed in these countries. And I think there's a clear sense of people saying, you know, our problems come first and those people abroad come second. And populist politics has been on the rise. And so you've seen a shift in sentiment. And again, this hasn't just happened overnight. This is something that's been growing in the different politics around the world and how elections have changed that. There's clearly been shifts in geopolitical situation as well, a priority of defense spending now. We've seen Ukraine. This is very much the reason that the UK government gave for the shift in their reductions in aid. They clearly made a straight exchange for cutting aid and giving to defense spending. So we're seeing that as well. And more generally in relation to the UN, we're just seeing a general erosion of support for multilateral institutions such as the UN, and a very much a kind of transactional view of international relations, and this has just relegated foreign aid down the list of priorities, unfortunately.
To what extent would you say that this crisis is one of the UN's own making?
So typically in these situations when the funding drops, everyone suddenly starts questioning, well, actually foreign aid, doesn't work. And there's been many people criticizing it. There's many people criticizing the UN and saying, well, actually it's the UN's fault. I think that's a bit of a simplistic way of looking at it. I think, the what has prompted this has been a shift, as I was saying, that has reduced levels of funding, has reduced levels of support. That said, it has brought some hard truths for the UN that has failed to reform over many years. There's been clear signs as to the way the organization has been dysfunctional about the way that it's worked in many ways. And many of these problems could have been addressed early. And so they're being brought to the fore now. And so there's a lot of criticism of that and saying, well, why weren't these situations dealt with before? And I think on the one hand, this is true, but we also need to see this now as an opportunity. There's an opportunity now to really change the organization, which won't address, however much it reforms, it still won't address the funding cuts. That's what's really putting lives at risk. But it can make the organization more efficient, more effective, and begin to gain its kind of role in the world again.
How can the UN be restructured and reformed and, made more efficient, maybe, in order to stay relevant and carry out the work it was created to do?
So on the one hand, the UN is made up by member states, and so a lot is a reform of the UN in terms of the Security Council that has increasingly failed to deal with many crises around the world. We've seen it again with Gaza, Iran now again, and many other crises. But the UN is a system of agencies. They can also be reformed to become more effective. The Secretary General launched earlier this year in March something called UN 80 to coincide with the 80th anniversary of the world body. And this he's attempting to bring about a more efficient and a more effective organization. So some of the proposals being made are moving many parts of the UN from New York from Geneva to other places in the world, cutting staff, reducing workforces, looking at more common services. And then eventually there have been proposals for the restructuring wholesale of the organization in terms of actually merging different parts of the UN. And I think many people will see that also as welcome. So there's a lot that could be done to make it much more efficient and effective.
Bottom line, then, would you say that this could be a blessing in disguise for the UN?
A blessing in disguise in a way, but quite a difficult pill to swallow, if we could put it like that. I mean, it cannot be underlined quite how much of a financial impact these cuts in foreign aid are causing the organization. We're talking about 30% cuts to large organizations, laying off of thousands of staff. So in that sense, it's a bit of a brutal reality in the way in which it's been conducted in a very arbitrary way, a very forced way, particularly the withdrawal of US funding. At the same time, it hopefully will be a wake-up call to the organization really to reform itself, to look at some of these issues that have been long-standing about how it hasn't been the most efficient and effective organization. In that sense, yeah, this could be seen as an opportunity to bring about quite fundamental changes to the organization.
Damian Lilly, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you.